I'm Pedro da Costa, editorial fellow here at the Peterson Institute for International Economics, and I'm joined by our president, Adam Posen, and we're talking about Brexit.
Fun.
How are you, Adam?
Very good, thanks.
So let's talk about the impetus for this whole debate, right? There's been so many exits that we've talked about. There's been Scottish independence, Catalonia, Greece, and now Brexit is the latest term du jour. What's the real political driving force behind it within Britain?
I think within Britain there's two forces. There's an understandable one that the UK populace, a lot of them have always been a little scared of too much centralization in Europe. That when they signed up for the European Union, they wanted it as a union of member states and not as an ever closer union. And so there's always been some pushback from a lot of British about the concentration of power. But there's also an uglier and frankly more self-destructive side of late, which is concocting all kinds of fantasies about if the UK left the EU in some sense, their economy would be unshackled, they wouldn't have so many poor immigrants taking their benefits, they wouldn't be subject to terrible regulations, they wouldn't be forced to open their borders in various ways, all of which frankly is nonsense. And it's just pandering to the same kind of ugliness as Donald Trump in this country. So there's both a long-standing understanding of Britain not wanting to be part of a centralized Europe, and then a more recent ugly sort of nationalism.
Got it. So there's the technocratic opposition and the nationalistic one. And so, what are the benefits that the proponents, say that they would get, and what do you see as the potential costs of an exit from the EU? And how is it different from like exiting a currency union versus exiting the EU, if you could make that distinction?
Well, I think it's an important distinction to make, that people talk a lot about the euro, and the euro has obviously not had a very good run of it lately, but the UK is not part of the euro. The UK has an independent monetary policy, has the pound, not the euro, so that's not really the issue. The issue in the EU is the combination of political and economic laws that the EU constitutes. And the premise, the reason why even Margaret Thatcher 30 years ago was in favor of the UK being part of the EU was that that meant the UK was part of a larger bloc economically, that it could go negotiate trade deals. It wasn't just the UK, it was the UK plus Germany plus France plus Italy, and you could really get advantages. It was also in foreign policy that they could so-called punch above their weight, because Britain would be a leading role in EU foreign policy, but would get to speak for a broader union. And on the narrow economics, it was about breaking down barriers within the single market so that you could have services and goods flowing freely across Western Europe. The intellectual argument, such as it is for Brexit on the economic side, is that Brussels has actually become a place that puts out lots of bad regulations, crazy regulations about what can be labeled a sausage and what can't be labeled a sausage, what people can do, how many hours they can work. And increasingly, the concern lately has been that low-skilled or low-wage workers from other parts of Europe can come into the UK, vote, collect benefits, and so on.
And you have the crisis in Calais, perhaps, as a very...
It's a very vivid illustration of that kind of thing. Now, this is completely wrong on its head. It's sort of similar to in the US again, when everybody says, oh, it's red tape in Washington's killing the US economy. Well, the fact is, in Europe, productivity growth in the UK has been much lower than many other European economies, including Spain and Germany and Ireland, all of which are more constrained by the EU than the UK, which has lots of opt-outs and singularities. And so the idea that somehow the EU is the barrier to British productivity is just false. Similarly on the migration issue, it's not even a question of they don't understand the issue, it's they miss the point. Part of the strength of the UK economy for the last 15 years has been lots of immigrants coming from Europe, and not just poor Europe. I mean, there are 700,000 French people working in the UK, some in hospitality, some in financial services. There's been Polish people, there's been all kinds of people, and this has added on net to UK growth and helped balance the UK budget. So it's a lot of fantasies. In the background...
So the exit would reverse all those benefits, presumably?
Well, it would certainly get in the way of them, and it's not clear what you would gain. There is this fantasy that you would not have all these regulations and everything would be wonderful. There's an even stronger version of the fantasy put out there by people like Neil Ferguson that you would change the EU, the Northern Europeans like the Germans and the Swedes would get together with the UK and turn the EU into some sort of, libertarian fantasy land. And sorry to keep using the word fantasy, but it really is. It's just nonsensical thinking. And instead, what's going to happen is if the UK were to go out, they would lose all these additional bargaining power they get by being part of a larger group. They would still have to meet all kinds of EU standards if they wanted to trade with the EU. They wanted to export anything to the EU. And frankly, if they don't export to the EU, they're in huge trouble.
Yeah.
And they would cut off the source of all these talented labor that comes their way.
Sure. Now, as a former member of the Bank of England, how would this impact the UK economy? Is it impossible to estimate the hit from Brexit because it was just too uncertain? And what also would be the implications for monetary policy? The Bank of England, of course, has been hinting at rate hikes since 2014, and they've never come. And so if there was a further weakening in the economy, presumably that would have implications for rates as well.
You're absolutely right to raise this. But what I think the way to think about this is, Pedro, we should think about it as a self-induced financial crisis, a self-inflicted wound. So what's going to happen, and we're already seeing this in the volatility data, in the stocks, in the interest rate spreads, is that there's going to be all kinds of people who say, money in UK is riskier than it once was. Whether it's British or foreigners, they're going to say, maybe Tata or Toyota or whoever is going to be less likely to keep their investment here instead of in Ireland or Spain if they're not part of the EU. Maybe there's going to be more volatility because the governments in the UK will be untethered and can do all kinds of strange things.
Yeah.
And so what's likely to happen, and we've seen this, there aren't many examples similar to Brexit, but we've seen this when countries sort of opt out of integration. What you usually get is a run-up in volatility, a weakening of the currency, and as a result, the central bank has no choice but to raise interest rates hugely. And so at a minimum, you would expect this to induce a lot of uncertainty and financial volatility ahead of the Brexit. And if it occurred, you would probably see very high interest rates, a fall in the currency, a lot of inflation, and a recession. And whatever you think is going to be the benefits of Brexit, the cost of that recession is going to way outweigh them.
As the recent crisis probably gives us a certain hint of that.
You're right.
Thank you so much, Adam. I appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me.